Good evening, Facebook. Welcome to another Sunday evening session with Brian and Janice. We welcome you all to join us today, and we are so excited to bring with you this evening another segment of the Civil Rights Act. It is very important that we share with you that what we are doing is giving you historical facts and information pertaining to civil rights and how it affected us yesterday on forward till today. So if you are watching and you need a pen or a notepad to take notes, please do so, because this information is actually researched and it is factual. And what we encourage you to do is to know your history. It is very important. If you may not be able to recite it verbatim, but the information that we are trying to provide to you, it is so worthy and it's so helpful to you to know this history. All right, we're going to start with the Civil Rights Act. We're going to chime in again on that this weekend because we want people to get it, to really get it and to understand it. All right, today we're talking about the battle for the souls of Black people. That is how crucial it is, and that is exactly what we're doing. There is an ongoing battle out there for our very loving souls, because there is so much going on today that is that is important that we know this information, because what's going to take place between now and November the 3rd is paramount. It is just the beginning about the worst that this country has ever seen. If we don't do our part in getting this information, researching, sharing, and just know that what we do today up until November the 3rd is going to matter to us greatly. So we got to go back to 1875, when the Civil Rights Act was first instituted. Most people don't even know that. They're thinking it started in 1965, but it actually was instituted in 1875, and it was introduced on the House floor by Charles Sumner. He was the senator of Massachusetts in 1870, and that's something that I'm recently learning. So Civil Rights Act was actually brought to the Senate floor in 1875. But what happened is that Charles Sumner died of a heart attack before the passage of the bill. So after he dies, another Massachusetts senator took over. His name was George Boughton. The bill on the floor, he argued the bill on the floor while giving a detailed analysis of what the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendment was supposed to look like. So I'm going to let Brian take it on a little bit from here, but it's very important that you get this information, because not many people are going to share this with you. You can research it for yourself. It is always good to research for yourself, and that way you can chime off of what the factual information that's being shared with you at this time.
Mm-hmm. So when we talk about civil rights has always been an issue in America, simply as it relates to Black people, simply because we have not been deemed as citizens. So when you look at the 1870 debate on the floor with Charles Sumner, part of that was as it relates to introducing citizenship concerning the freed and enslaved people at that time. So the whole concept of the 1875 Civil Rights Act was to introduce to a people that had been oppressed forms of liberty that they could enjoy alongside those that had oppressed them. So the Civil Rights Act was basically trying to correct some of the ills that had been done by way of enslavement and oppression based on the rule of the slave master. So when you look at the 1875 Civil Rights Act that passed March the 1st of 1875, passed the House floor, I think the vote was like 32 to 28, somewhere around there.
Okay. So we didn't win by a landslide.
It wasn't a landslide vote, but the vote did get through.
Okay.
What the 1875 Civil Rights Act did was basically state that all enslaved people that had now been freed, up under the Emancipation Proclamation that had been freed through the Emancipation Proclamation could now enjoy the same liberties as any other citizen in the United States. Some of those liberties actually were being able to go into public places without discriminations, being able to take part in public education, all of those things. That's when we see public schools actually set up for African American students. They were able to partake in the purchase of things such as houses.
Yes.
Okay, so the 1875 Civil Rights Act was put in place, like I said, to try to correct those ills and to try to introduce to an enslaved people. Also, not only that, let me back up for a second, because the 1875 Civil Rights Act also tried to correct the failed administration as it relates to the Freedmen's Bureau.
Oh, yes.
Okay. All right. So what was the Freedmen's Bureau? The Freedmen's Bureau was basically set up after the emancipation to make sure that economic wealth was distributed to those enslaved, 4 million enslaved Africans at the time that had now been freed under the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, quote unquote, just keep in mind, when we talk about the 4 million slaves, African slaves that were freed, I like to refer to those that were of the southern states, those that were in the southern states. Really, the focus was not on the northern states, which we know was the Union. Okay, but whenever we deal with civil rights reconstruction period, it basically concentrates on those southern states: Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, Tennessee. Okay, those that southern perimeter, Louisiana, okay, Texas. It basically focuses on that particular region. So we're talking about 4 million slaves that were enslaved in the southern states that had been emancipated, and the Reconstruction, what we know as the Reconstruction period, introduced the Federal Freedoms Bureau, which was set up by the government and run by basically abolitionists. That was a failed experiment. When in the changing of the guard, when Andrew Johnson comes in after the assassination of President Lincoln, okay, he rescinds the actual federal junctures and legislation that puts in place all of the things that would be given to the slaves to try to help them and assist them in now becoming citizens. Part of that was the redistribution of wealth. Well, when Johnson rescinds that, he turns the clock back basically about 100 years. Okay, so from that point, from 1865, like I said, 1875, within that 10-year period, what began to be introduced from that point after Reconstruction failed was what we know as Jim Crow laws. Up under Jim Crow laws, the South adopted what they call the Black Codes. Basically, the Black Codes were laws that stated that the slaves could not do certain things based on what the states put in place. Just to give you an example, if you were caught after 6 p.m. without a work permit, you could be arrested, in prison, arrested, and go to jail. That is how the peonage system went from literally thousands to hundreds of thousands in less than a span of 20 to 30 years within the black population after that. Okay, because the Black Codes were put in place as a form of re-implementing slavery up under legislation. Okay? All right, so when we look at this, why is that important as it relates to us today? Now, 1875 Civil Rights Act, like you said, baby, most people don't even know that there was an 1875 Civil Rights Act, because in 1883, the United States Supreme Court, and we know that supreme is the root word of supremacy. So the United States White Supremacist Court overturned the 1875 Civil Rights Act. They rescinded it in 1883. Okay, and basically they stated that up under the 14th Amendment, that all people the slaves, those that were enslaved, had the rights up under the 14th Amendment to act in regard to their freedoms as it relates to them being able to frequent places, them being able to go to certain places without discriminations, so on and so forth. And the main thing that it did was it directed the authority to the states and not individuals, which meaning that the states set the behavior legislation in place as it relates to their particular population.
Okay.
So it took the power away from the individuals. It took the power away from the slaves being able to say, we're going to sue the federal government if we're not treated in a just and fair manner. And it returned the power to the states so that the states could now dictate legislation as it relates to the control of the population of their citizenship, okay, and their citizenry. So when it did that, the state made laws that now usurped authority as it related to how the slaves would live, exist, what the states could do, couldn't do as it related to the slaves, so on and so forth. So civil rights have always been the argument as it relates to the soul of this country, because black people have never enjoyed civil rights. We have never really had civil rights. So the civil struggle comes into play because we have not yet experienced or obtained those things up under the United States Constitution that states that citizens are entitled to. Okay, we have not yet experienced that in its full capacity. We have experienced bits and pieces of it, but the majority of black people are still at this moment oppressed by a system that will not allow them to flourish and that has put in place certain parameters and certain barriers that keeps them from achieving.
Wow.
So the Civil Rights Act, excuse me, when we look at Civil Rights Act, civil rights legislation is always to try to correct the ills and allow all people to experience the entitlements that the Constitution offers to citizens. Okay? We have not yet experienced that as it relates to the Civil Rights Act. So the 1875 Civil Rights Act, basically, like you were reading, basically tried to correct some of those ills. It tried to correct some of those wrongdoings and tried to wipe away some of those disparities, like wealth disparity, educational disparity. It tried to lessen the gap between the races concerning those institutions. And unfortunately, it did not do it. Okay? Unfortunately, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, like I said, was rescinded in 1883 by the United States Supreme Court. And then we will undergo another 70 years of Jim Crow segregation.
Right. And that's why Martin came and was fighting for us.
Up into the civil. So what we were discussing, Facebook family, we paused for a second there.
Yes.
All right, so we're back with you. But what we were discussing is the 1964 Civil Rights Act that is taken up by Dr. King and the SCLC. Okay, at the time. What they basically do is they piggyback off of the 1875 Civil Rights Act. Mm-hmm. And basically what the 1964 Civil Rights Act does is it offers public freedoms for us to enjoy, and the public freedoms states pretty much basically that the United States government, or let me rephrase that no public institution can discriminate against an individual based on race, color, creed, religion, origin, ethnicity. And that individuals would have the right to enter into public institutions, into public facilities be it a park that's owned by the government, okay, owned by state, city, county government, enter into public schools, enter into certain eating establishments. So if that eating establishment was in a building that was in a vicinity of the federal, other federal buildings, downtown area in particular, okay, that those people had the rights to partake in entering into public places and being able to be served without any discrimination based on their color, based on their sex, based on their race, based on their origin. So now, let me say that. Having said that, let me talk about the damage that was done as well as it relates to the civil rights struggle in the Civil Rights Act. One thing that it did that was a disservice to us is that it said based on color, okay? So that means that it could be anybody. When the 1875 Civil Rights Act was put in place, it was put in place to deal with those that were enslaved. That's a big difference, okay? So when 1964 Civil Rights Act does not deal specifically with the descendants of those that were enslaved. It deals with people of color, which includes immigrants that were also over here that were not considered to be of Eurasian descent. Okay? So it didn't really deal with the African American problem, okay, of us being discriminated against. So when you look back at the 1964 Civil Rights Act that was, championed by Dr. King, the SCLC, and all of our great civil rights leaders, kudos to them and what they did, but it did not take up the banner of the 1875 Civil Rights Act by the abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner and Frederick Douglass and some other abolitionist senators that were fighting for the rights of enslaved people. There's a big difference, okay? So now any and everybody can come up under, that's why you see now the LBGT community, nothing against what a person wants to do in their own bedroom, that's up to them. But women, you understand what I'm saying? Anybody, immigrants, Hispanics, Asians, Indians, anybody now can come up under the 1964 Civil Rights Act and say that, no, we're being discriminated against or treated unfairly in this particular sector of our government or in our city. And they can file lawsuits based off of the 1964 Act, which should have been directed solely at correcting issues in the black community. Not in everybody else community. So that is part of, I say, the undoing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and how that it has not benefited us as a people more than it has benefited other groups in the United States, because now everybody comes up under the banner of justice as it relates to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And because they did not designate this was for black people, African American people, now everybody uses that to try to get something as it relates to policies in legislation in government. Okay, so that's where we are today when it comes to the Civil Rights Act and how it did not dismiss some of the ills. It did not lessen the blow of slavery and what we experienced coming out of slavery as it relates to the economic and wealth gap between whites and black. It did not correct the ills, unfortunately, of education. Okay, so when we look at the Civil Rights Act, also when we look at Brown versus the Board of Education, we look at those things. The integration portion of what people look at in the 1964 Civil Rights Act did not help our community. It actually hurt our community, because what it did is it pushed teachers out of our schools. What it did is allowed the states to redistribute monies from the public school systems to school systems that they would create and fight for funding for public funding that was supposed to be for the public school system. That's why I'm not a proponent, and forgive me all teachers, I have a sister that's an educator, but I think the charter school systems is no more than a dummy system to actually funnel money from the public school system into institutions that are created by European, created by other persuasions, ethnic persuasions, that do not want their children in the same classroom as African American children. So charter school systems we see are set up under in the 1990s, up under the Bill Clinton administration, and all of those. We see the blunt of that coming into play. So there are many things when we look at the 1964 Civil Rights Act that it backfired on us. So integration, the portion of the Civil Rights Act that says that public venues cannot discriminate against a person based on their race, creed, sex, religion, all of those things. Well, when the integration portion of that began to take place, it pushed our teachers out of our schools, closed our schools down, pushed our teachers into the majority white schools at the time. It took our doctors out of our communities. It took our businesses, drugstores, hospitals, theaters, cab companies, bus companies. It took our business leaders, and it took our intellectual property out of our communities and put them into the hospitals that were majority white. Put them into, now closed down their businesses and made them go to work for companies and other businesses in the same line of work. And as all of that is happening, wealth constantly was leaving our community.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
So when we look at what the Civil Rights Act,
important, Brian.
Yes, it is. Because when we look at what the Civil Rights Act, what they intended for it to do based on what it did, it hurt us more than helped us. Okay. Now, there are some advantages to the Civil Rights Act as it relates to some things that we were able to get concerning funding in public schools, but the public schools did not remain black. Okay. So if we could have taken that same funding and put it into a black institution and got the same books that were being used in our counterparts institution, we would have been fine, because we had the talent in the classroom by way of educators that were better than our counterparts teachers. So what if we could have had that funding also coming to our businesses? You see what I'm saying? Those monies coming back into our communities. We could have continued to create businesses. We could have continued to build our communities, build the infrastructure in our communities. So those are the things when we talk about the Civil Rights Act and the integration portion of the Civil Rights Act. Those are the things that hurt us as a community, because once the integration process started, it depleted the resources, it depleted the intellectual property, it depleted the health care portion of our community when it comes to black doctors being in our community and black doctors being encouraged to stay in our communities, to open up offices in our community. It just depleted all of that. Okay. So the gap, like I said, became wider and wider. And Lyndon B. Johnson even said this when we talk about his Howard speech. He said that the gap as it relates to African Americans, that the families have continued to break down. This is after the Civil Rights Act was passed, after he signed into law the Civil Rights Act. He said infant mortality in the black community is up. Poverty is up. Education as it relates to kids not finishing school and dropping out. The dropout rate was higher.
Yes.
So every category, Lyndon B. Johnson at a historical black college and university, Howard, gives a commencement speech in 1965, June of 1965. And the stats that he gives, he says that every area in the black community has gone up, not down, after the signing of the Civil Rights Act. Now, unfortunately, it was up under his administration after JFK was assassinated, him finishing out that term.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
So those things were already trending up. They did not get better, they got worse. Okay. So we have to step back and take a look at, even today, is civil rights what we should be arguing for? We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Yeah. So what we have to do is take what's in place, and those parts of the legislation that does not work for us, we have to do something else with that. We have to make it reconstructed. That word again is to where it works for African American people. Okay. And then the portion that relates to all other people, you have a section, if you will, just like bills are broken down into sections. Okay. You have a section that applies to them. But to correct the ills of the black community, we need to have legislation in place that deals specifically with our problems that stem from being enslaved for 300 years and 100 years of Jim Crow segregation. Okay. So what were you going to say as it relates to it?
Oh, okay. Wow. I was getting into that, Brian. Well, and what Brian is trying to translate to us, he's giving us the history for us to move forward, to look at where we are right now, to see that things really haven't changed much at all. In fact, there are a lot of things that are put in place that's being covered up. And we look at the fact that we got a lot of blacks in legislature. We have a lot of blacks that Congress, men and women in the Senate, and we think that we have arrived. We got blacks in corporate America. We got blacks that are attorneys. We got blacks that are civil rights attorneys. All those things have been put in place, and those people rightfully have worked and earned those titles and degrees. But what is happening with our community? Yes, by far, we have come a ways in that light, but what are we doing for the less fortunate? What are we doing to pull our people up? What are we doing to get our people out of the ghettos? What are we doing with the public school educational system in places like Montgomery, Alabama, Selma, Alabama, and other southern areas? What are we doing to better those institutions and those public school systems? You got people now that are moving out of the cities that have become predominantly white. They're going into the suburban areas, and which is forcing more blacks to be put in one location where that area is looking like, impoverished. Then they're moving into rural.
Well, let's go back and let me stop you before you get too far drawn off the subject. What you have to realize is when you talk about systemic racism, governmental systems were put in place that created the dynamic of what we know as the ghettos. Okay. What we know as, the unfair housing, which in 1964, part of the 1968 Equal and Fair Housing Act was put in place. Okay. But we know that systematically the government designed ghettos, because we know that ghettos is a concept out of the Eurasian community, and basically is out of the Jewish community, the European Jews. That term ghetto comes through their experience as it relates to being up under a regime, a dictatorship regime, where they were relegated to what they call block housing. Okay, so that makes its way into our communities in the late 60s. After the Vietnam 60s, early 70s, after the Vietnam War, we start seeing the development of what we know as ghettos or block housings. in the colored people community. Now, that was by systematic design. That was by structural engineering concerning the government wanting to isolate a population of African people in a central area so that they would know where those people groups were, and so they could keep a portion of that city and a portion of the population isolated to one area, and then they build around that. So that was put in place as it relates to development, okay, and investment. After we see that, sweetheart, comes the whole system of what we know as redlining, or drawing lines in districts around the colored community and putting business developments around the colored community, far away from the colored community, that it would not affect business, but yet at the same time would draw the colored people's dollars into their business.
Okay.
Yet separated, we don't want to be apart, but we do want to service their community because they have dollars. And then we're far enough away to where our European people and our colleagues do not fear coming to our business and shopping in the areas that is 2, 3, 4 miles from the ghetto. Okay, so it was systematically designed. When you look at the city of Montgomery, Alabama, the downtown area was 3 to 4 miles away from the main project areas in Montgomery, which was Tulane Court at one time, Trentham Court at one time, and you had Young Fort, when I was young, Young Fort Village, which was off on the north side, 2 miles away from the police department, right before you go into the Chisholm area, which was the white depressed area of Montgomery. So when we look at these things, we have to step back and understand why these systems were created. Why were they designed? They were designed to keep tabs, and I just have to say it what it is, to spy on, okay? And they do the same thing today. The funny thing is, whenever you, and let's just say it, and you said something very important, the majority of our people still struggle with being able to afford housing, okay? So if you go into, whether it be city, county, government projects, or ghettos, if you are a participant of Section 8, guess what that allows them to do? They blacklist you. You're on the list now, and they know exactly, they again systematically can isolate you based on a certain area of the city where the majority of Section 8 housing is. Okay, so whether you are a landlord, black landlord, or a black investor, even like myself, okay, and if I'm buying up homes in a specific area that real estate companies advertise for investors to come in and that it would be good Section 8 housing, then that is where you're going to find a heavy population of African American people that are depressed as it relates to economics. So you're still systematically labeling those people. You're still tracking those people by way of the system that is being created. Section 8 housing, yes, was only created because of the gentrification of the downtown areas. So any projects in and around downtown area, okay, when they were torn down to develop the downtown area, Section 8 housing was put in place as it relates to the population of the city in certain areas. Still, the majority of those that were moved are still moved into depressed financial areas of the city. Okay, it's a blacklist. And then it allows real estate lines to continue to be drawn, real estate lines to continue to be looked at as it relates to education. Do you understand? So when you have business developers coming in, that's why you hear on the news that developers want to come into a city that has a good education system, and they talk about Montgomery education system is so poor and there's so much crime going on and the students are this and that. Well, that is by systematic design. So in that systematic design, what they do is they now move the industrious developers that come in to the outskirts of the city and put their children and those families that come to run the company, the industrial factories, and to be over the industrial factories, and to basically be, but might as well say it, slave masters over the subjects or the laborers that are going to be employed by these industrious developmental type of factories, manufacturers that are coming in. They move their families to the outskirts, and their families are the first to be able to get into the charter schools, into the advanced schools. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
They are put on the list first. You can have your child on the list for 4 years, and if the CEO's child needs to get in that charter school that's running the manufacturing plant, okay, that's on the outskirts of the city, guess who child is going to get there first? Okay, so everything that is done systematically by state government, county government, city government, the federal government. We have to understand that. If we are going to learn how to function within the system and understand the game, understand how the system works and how it has purposely, systematically discriminated against us, and continue to do that because the system has not changed.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So there needs not be any new legislation wrote as it relates to the system concerning how it treats you. The new legislation that needs to be put in place should alter how it treats you. You understand that? Mm-hmm. Okay. So it should rebuttal how it treats those that are impoverished, those that are poor. And then, okay, so we're looking at that. So let's move a step up. Let's look at or go back, take a step back, and then move forward. When you even look at the welfare system created and made poor whites into middle class whites.
Yes.
And then when black mothers began to take advantage
of the
welfare system through aid for dependent children, fair housing, things like that, they wanted then at that time to shut it down because they felt like whites that had partaken in that system all of those 10, 20 years before blacks could ever get into the system, right. 30 years roughly, right. Okay? Those white had moved from a poverty status to now a middle class status. Okay? When blacks finally got an opportunity to start receiving some of those social welfare benefits, and everybody talk about, you hear the word thrown around by different party persuasions, socialist country. Well, what made a great majority of middle class people was this socialist country that gave them social welfare benefits. Okay, so when we start to partake in it, that's when the attitude changes. About the system that was created, because it wasn't created for us. So they have to make sure that if it starts to work for us, to cut it off.
Wow.
Okay, to deny us from participating and partaking in that system because it was not created for you. Okay, now they look at other ways by way of legislation, putting other things in place whereby they can continue to advance and you continue to be marginalized as it relates to your participation and partaking in this system. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Whew. We thank you all for joining today. I think we had a lot more to share. Brian kind of went left on us, but that's good. It was a good left turn. We needed that, and that's what helps us to understand exactly where we've come from and where we are today and where we need to go, because
Absolutely.
we're not there yet.
Absolutely.
By no means are we there yet. So I encourage you guys to do some research, reading. Brian, do you have any advice for areas that they can begin to look at to start researching this information?
Well, there's a good book that I'm reading right now that I think everybody should read. It's called Stamped from the Beginning, and it's by Brother Ibram X. Kendi. Okay. Stamped from the Beginning by Brother Kendi. Awesome book. Will help you to understand a whole lot of things that's going on right now as it relates to what has happened in the past and some of the racist ideologies, some of the racist ideas, the racist concepts that are still being used to not only divide us today, but to continue to systematically enslave us. So that's a good book. And then Anderson's book, The Black History Reader. 101 Questions You Never Thought to Ask by Dr. Claude Anderson. Excellent book. So we'll start you with those two. And if you once you get them, if you have any questions that you would you want to inquire about, like we said, we gave the email address, and we're still working on getting the YouTube channel up and going. But that would be good reading to help you understand also what we need to do to organize and to try to develop, our own plan of action.
Yes.
To where we can actively participate above and beyond just even talking about this. We're going to have to at some point take the next level in Alabama. Alabama is always slow, but I believe that is prime right now for leadership that will step out and say, look, I'm willing to lead, and I'm willing to take this to the next level here in this state and to do whatever needs to be done to try to correct some of the ills for the people of the state of Alabama. So all politics are local first, and then we take it to the national level. But we recruit organizations that are already doing the work in other states as well, some of our brothers and sisters that are fighting and that understand the significance of what it is that we really need. But start with those two books, real good books.
And as you can see, Brian and I are wearing the Wakanda Forever shirts in honor of Chadwick Boseman.
Yes.
Who recently passed this past week, a 43-year-old that died from colon cancer. And I do want to encourage people to not neglect your health. I'm in the healthcare industry. I've been a nurse for right at 30 years now. And I see and deal with it every day. So it is important that we go and get ourselves checked out. As African Americans, for so many years, we've been deprived of having the resources and the access to get the proper health care. It is here for us. It is available for you and everyone out there. So don't take your health for granted. The guidelines have now been set that you can get your first colonoscopy at the age of 45. If you're having any GI problems or abdominal discomforts or problems, you can get that colonoscopy before the age of 45. But for just preventive health, you can get it at the age of 45. So I do want to encourage everybody to take care of yourself.
Absolutely.
Be mindful, be wise, share with as many people as you can. Be that comforted person, be that support system for, a family member or friend to say, hey, I'll go with you. I'll go with you and I'll hold your hand all the way. Yeah. So let's do it.
Yes, and again, shout out to our fallen ancestor, now Brother Chadwick Boseman, just an awesome actor,
yes,
entertainer, and from all things that I've read this past week, was just a phenomenal human being.
Yes.
And so, our prayers continue to go up as it relates to his family and those that were close to him. But yes, we are the real Wakanda. We are the real Black Panthers. We are, and we could talk about that as we continue to go on.
Yes.
We have to carry on the legacy of the Fred Hamptons, the H. Rap Browns, the Stokely Carmichaels. We have to carry on the legacies of Malcolm and Garvey and all
Martin.
of those other great men.
Yes.
Martin, yes. So, we are a Black Panther nation.
Yes, we are.
So we are Wakanda nation. So that is something that, we could talk about. But yes, again, rest in power to Brother Chadwick. Yeah.
Yes.
That's an ancestor now.
Amen. Mm-hmm. Thanks for joining us, you guys, and look forward to seeing you next Sunday. And share this video with as many people as you possibly can. I encourage you to share. I encourage you to read. Be mindful. Read. Be diligent. Take time out of your day every day and read something about your history. It is so important.
Yes.
Okay?
All right. Peace, family.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a blessed week.